Hello, and welcome to episode 133 of Prose. This week, try to make it over a mountain pass with a famous pioneer family. You heard correctly. This week we only have one rather long short story. It is a piece of historical fiction that has a great many primary sources embedded within, and I hope you'll enjoy it. I am releasing it today in honor of my mother's birthday. She is a history lover extraordinaire, and I remember my first knowledge of this particular historical happenstance coming first from her. Happy birthday, Mama. While you listen, please head over to prosepodcast.com as our one-stop shop for all things prose. From there, you can find the program on social media, the small but growing online store, and ways to subscribe. Moreover, our Patreon is over there, and you should check that out. But I won't go on and on about that this time around because I want to get to the story, so let's do that, shall we? This week, in honor of my mother, we have Donner. Enjoy. Donner, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. Don't you ever get tired of staring at words, Alitha? Alitha lowered the sheaf of papers and looked up with an arched eyebrow. I do not, Noah James. And what business is it of yours anyway? Don't you have work to do? You've got wagons and oxen and horses to look after. We're about to get going up on through that pass soon, and you don't want me telling Daddy that you're sloughing off now, do you? Fine, Alitha. You enjoy all that fantasizing. I'll stay right here in the real world. We're real-life explorers, you know. I don't know why you'd choose to read when you can take in God's country. With that, Noah turned on his heel and sauntered off, skittering a bit on the still frost-covered ground. That boy fancied her. Alitha might be young, but she had eyes and good sense, so her mother said. But Noah wasn't a good match for her. She knew that to be true, too. He was a teamster. Her daddy was something more, which made her something more. The boy was concerned with draft animals and wrestling, whereas she couldn't get enough of all those fantastic worlds of so many authors' minds. Alitha turned back to her papers and frowned. She had thought of starting a journal back in Independence, but for whatever reason, she just never had. Now that they were out past the edge of the civilized world and the frontier land was growing less and less civilized by the day, she couldn't help but scold herself. The libraries were long gone and far away now, and Daddy hadn't allowed them the luxury of bringing books along with them. We'll buy new when we get to California, Liffy, her father had promised her. So Alitha had left behind her own small but growing library and set out westward from Missouri, with nothing but the memories of the worlds built by Cooper, Hugo, Thackeray, Dumas, and her most favorite of all, Dickens. She had read those novels so many times that the memories were potent. That was a boon on this journey out through the wilds of America. She and Natty Bumppo could navigate the ever-changing landscape together. Edmond Dantes could dashingly recount how lucky the men of the wagon train were to be graced by her beauty. She could stroll the boulevards of Bièvre, wondering which turn might bring forth her newest admirer from the lamplight. Alitha could break the unjust laws alongside Catherine Hayes, spitting in the eyes of any lawmen that might try to bring them in. Best of all, she could share in her adventures and her parallel life with Nell Trent. Just like Nell, she didn't live with both of her parents. Sometimes she trusted people too much, and she had an adventurous spirit that some might say was presumptuous or precocious. Thankfully, despite some bumps in the road, her life had been a bit less tumultuous than Nell's, but she still thought of the Dickensian girl as a kindred spirit. Just like Noah James, her friends and family always gave her grief about her love of books and words. But out here, in the never-ending expanse they were trudging through, she was glad of her choices to all but commit those favorite texts of hers to memory. Elitha stood up from a rock on which she'd been sitting, stretching a bit from being sat that long in the cold, and started to make her way back to the wagons where the rest of her family was. With it being so close to time to start moving again after this short respite, the wagon train was buzzing with activity. People hustling and shuffling this way and that, making good to head out for the day. Before any big drive forward, her family would be abuzz in their own right. Tamsin, whom Elitha just couldn't come to call mother, would be chasing Eliza, Georgia, and Frances. Those little girls sure gave her stepmother a run for her money. If she were a betting girl, she'd wager her sister Leanna would have been enlisted to help wrangle their step-siblings. For such a small stature, those little ones sure could move. Add in Auntie Elizabeth along with her 5 little ones, baby Samuel, Louis, Isaac, Mary, and George, and the womenfolk had quite the handful on any given morning. No doubt Daddy and Uncle Jacob were shouting and calling and ordering the teamsters, Cousin Solomon and Cousin William around, and ensuring the whole train was up for some more climbing through the mountains. This newest pass through the mountains was meant to be the last before they came down and out into California. Daddy and Uncle Jacob were keen to move and move fast, well ahead of any serious snowfall. It was funny how snow had come to dictate her life. Every decision they made was predicated on snowfall. When it would start, where it would start. She had seen snows before in Missouri. She loved the magic of the snows back in Missouri. But all the pioneers and trappers and Indians swore you had never seen snowfall until you saw it out on these western mountains. They said it could come down in blankets, making it where you couldn't see your own hands held out in front of you. They said it could stack up 3 times the height of a man in not an hour. Elitha thought those were tall tales told by bored men. As she made her way through the quilt of campfires and wagons being hitched, Elitha shivered. It had been cold for some time now. September had seen the morning dawn with ground frozen hard as a rock time and again. They sometimes thought it might have been a dusting of snow and not frost. And now, they were well into October. They had not yet seen a real snow, so this one last push through the newest range of mountains and into California was still possible. Or at least that's what Daddy kept saying. She walked slowly, almost wholly lost in her thoughts, but aware enough to hear the various greetings being lobbed at her as she strode through the camp. "Marnin' Elitha!" That was John Breen. He was a little younger than Elitha, but always keen to say hello. She couldn't help but grin every time she heard that little touch of an Irish accent he'd inherited from his ma and pa. "Fine morning. Tell thine mother I'll be returning her pot to her shortly. It still needs washing." Mrs. Kiesberg, thick German pronunciation chopping through the crisp October air. Elitha wondered at where the woman thought to get the water. Weren't they rationing that too? "Lithy! Do you see the snow on those mountaintops? We have never seen snowfall like that before, huh? Of course, John Landrum would be excited to see snows before they were ever even over these peaks. He fancied her too. He had the same hungry eyes for her as Noah James did. But Widow Murphy kept her son in line, so he had to be a bit more circumspect with his flirtations than Noah did. Elitha assumed this was John's way of reaching out innocently, so he could avoid his mother's hand across the back of his head in rebuke. All of these greetings and so many more made today feel normal. This morning was strange, though. The usual smells of the camps weren't there. They had begun to ration firewood a while back, opting to use the dried buffalo chips that the natives and other families had shown them to use. At first, Elitha had thought that dried dung for a fire source would be stinky and unsanitary. But she put on a brave face, summoned her best intrepid Natty Bumppo impression, compared this to the horrendous plights of Nell Trent, and began to stack buffalo chips to start their family fires, just like the rest of the group. It turned out that the burning of the chips wasn't unpleasant at all, and the fires seemed to burn just a touch hotter, brighter, and longer than the firewood. Still, there was a unique smell to all those fires burning on buffalo refuse. Something nutty, wild, untamed. But that wasn't snaking through the air alongside these calls of salutation this morning. She also noted that she couldn't smell the heavy scent of bacon or buffalo steaks, eggs, or, well, anything else at all cooking as she made her way closer to her family's main wagon. That all struck her as odd. Different. They had indeed been rationing a good long while, though. At least since Mr. Reed had convinced them that the Hastings cutoff was the only way to go to save both time and effort on getting to California before winter's snows came. That had been 81 days ago. July 31st, 1846. They had changed course to follow this newfangled cutoff that Mr. Reed swore they had to. In those 81 days, they had crossed the Wasatches, traversed the Great Salt Desert that played host to that new religion that had been banished from the East Country, been double-crossed by the Paiute Mr. Reed had sworn to Daddy were good and decent folk, and lost men and animals along the way. Elitha was a good Christian woman, same as everyone else. But she couldn't help but curse the name of that twice-damned Mr. Lansford Hastings. He'd sold them and every other pioneer family heading out west a bill of goods. They had sacrificed time, resources, and lives to that man's shortcut. And for what? So he could brag about updating Lewis, Clark, Smith, Stewart, Fitzpatrick, and all them's work? The arrogance of men. This is why she preferred Edmond Dantes to Noah James any day of the week. 81 days. To the day. She couldn't help but smile at that. Elitha doubted her daddy, Mr. Reed, Uncle Jacob, or any of the menfolk knew that precise figure. She was proud of her knowledge. Admittedly, it wasn't knowledge won on her own. Tamsen, Elitha's schoolteacher stepmother Daddy had found back in Missouri, was a resolute letter writer, keeping track of their journey day in and day out, and she often asked Elitha to read over her newest missives to her sister and other family back east. Elitha knew this was a kindness that Tamsen was extending for her benefit, her stepmother knowing how bereft she was having left all of her books behind. She might not be able to refer to Tamsen as mother just yet, but Elitha didn't harbor any ill will toward the woman. She made Daddy so very happy after all, and she had also brought Eliza, Georgia, and Frances into her and Leanna's lives. On top of all that, she was now helping keep Elitha in reading materials, even if it was only those letters. But that kind of sharing took trust and openness. It also took a fair touch of humility on Tamsen's part, acting like she needed Elitha's eyes to help revise her writings. That was kindness born of the Holy Spirit right there. Elitha thanked God for Tamsen in her letters, in her prayers, each and every night. However, lately, Tamsen's letters back east felt more like a burden than a treat. Elitha was desperate for reading material, and she didn't want to offend her stepmother, so she kept reading. But with each passing week, the letters became less and less confident, more and more bleak. Elitha trusted her daddy more than anyone. She thought he was the strongest, brightest man of the wagon train. He had been the one to say that Mr. Reed was a fool when everyone was fighting over taking the Hastings cutoff. He had lost to the train's vote, but he had been vocal about thinking differently, and he did not back down. He honored the vote in the end, because that's what an American does. Yet, Tamsen's writings seemed less convinced that everything was okay. She hadn't spoken specifically of the rationing too often, but she had been pretty clear that she didn't think making for California through October was a good idea. The letters had started as bright, even innocuous, simply telling her sister details about the trip.
I can give you no idea of this place at this time. It is supposed to be there will be 7,000 wagons starting from this place this season. We go to California to the Bay of Francisco. It is a 4-month trip. We have 3 wagons furnished with food and clothing, etc., drawn by 3 yoke of oxen each. I am willing to go and have no doubt it will be an advantage to our children and to us.
She went on and on about all the opportunities California held for them all, especially if they could turn it over into a full-fledged republic. They could be one of those elite families of that new land. She could found new schools and be the headmistress of a network of teachers and schoolhouses all up and down the coast. She speculated wildly about the fortunes God would bestow upon them as they took up their very own slice of manifest destiny, out there in this fabled place of plenty. The last letter she had written and sent out was now long sent, but it had already lost a lot of the natural cheer and hopefulness, and that had been months ago. July, Elitha thought, back in Wyoming.
Sister, we are now on the Platte, 200 miles from Fort Laramie. Our journey so far has been pleasant. Wood is now scarce, but buffalo chips are excellent. They kindle quick and retain heat surprisingly. We had this evening buffalo steaks broiled upon them that had the same flavor they would have on hickory coals. The weather seems to be cooling unnaturally fast for the season. We are not fearful, but we are wary. I am becoming more and more scared, though, with each day.
Tamsen had written numerous other letters since then, giving Elitha ample reading materials in the time when they were not making their way forward. But none had been sent out. There was nowhere to post them.
Lizzie!
She flinched, being torn from her thoughts. She had arrived at her family's wagons, and her father was in a dither. His hand was wrapped in bandages and had clearly been bleeding rather heavily, the white strips of cloth visibly wet from the wound.
Fire and consternation, girl. What have I told you about wandering off? Especially when we're about to go on the move. Especially when we're about to go up further into them mountains. Do you just not listen to your pa anymore?
I'm so sorry, Daddy,
You just got lost in your own head with all them characters from all your books again. Am I right? Am I right?
His tone softened along with his eyes. The furrows of his frown eased, and his lips quirked the smallest bit at the edges.
Yes, sir.
Elitha hung her head. He was right, of course. He always was. But his stony exterior cracked almost immediately at her apology, and he ruffled her hair like he had since she was small. She might be 16, right marrying age, but her daddy still thought of her as his little girl.
Well, hun, let's get you on over with Mother and the kids. It's high time we start heading over the slope to get beyond Truckee Lake. We can't be slowing down now. We've only got a month before the snows come. God, I was terrified for a minute there, Lizzie. Did you not hear the shot? Foster shot Pike while loading his gun. Accident. Bad omens. We need to get beyond this place. Mark my words.
Elitha's world lurched. She hadn't heard any shot. She must have been lost deeper within herself than she had thought. What a tragedy. William Pike had been one of the heroes of the Wasatch Mountains, riding ahead and helping make sure the wagon train could make their way safely up and over. What a waste. But the wagon train wasn't stopping for anyone, especially not now with this black portent hanging in the air. Noah James came walking by just then, winking at Elitha with that lean, hungry look of his as he made his way to the front of the wagons to take his place to drive the oxen. "We ready to get going, Mr. Donner?" "Fire and consternation, Noah, of course we are. Do you have to ask, boy?" At that, Noah picked up his pace, slapping the oxen on the flanks when he made it to the head of their smaller Donner family wagon train. Elitha began to hurry over to her place in the third wagon, but her daddy stopped her, pointing to the second wagon where he usually sat. "Ride with your pa today, Lithie?" She beamed at him and clambered up into the seat of her daddy's wagon as it began to move, the oxen slowly getting going with Noah and the teamsters' hoots, hollers, and slaps. Elitha looked up to the pass. It looked like it rose straight into the sky. A graying sky. A sky that was beginning to fall. It was snowing. Slow but steady, the snow began to fall as they began their ascent. As her daddy climbed up into the wagon next to her, she saw his smile slip and felt her own follow. Her mind went to her favorite poet of the moment, Longfellow, one of his poems from one of her books way back in Missouri. It had been all the rage a couple years back. She tried not to think of the doom of the Hesperus and that ill-fated father-daughter team of explorers. But she couldn't help but hear the verses she had committed to memory echoing in her mind. All that reading, now becoming a millstone. So as the ground became white with the snow, she did as the maiden did in that poem from that book, so very far away. And she clasped her hands and prayed that saved they might be. Thank you for listening to Donner, an original short story by me, Jared I. McGee. All sounds you have heard during this episode come from YouTube's free audio library and are being used under CC 01.0 public domain dedication licenses. And with that does it for Prose this week. I hope you enjoyed this little slice of historical fiction. And I just want to say one more time for the record, happy birthday, Mom. I hope you especially enjoyed this little tidbit of fictionalized history. Please join me in 2 weeks' time for our next full episode. And until then, please love those around you. Tell them that you do and embrace this life as it is always stranger than fiction. Thank you so much for listening.